Elena Marsh was on her knees scrubbing the marble floor of a billionaire's penthouse
Elena?
when she heard the one voice she had prayed her 6-year-old son would never hear. Her hands froze before her mind understood why. Water slipped from the rag between her fingers, spreading across the polished stone beneath her knees. Behind her, footsteps stopped.
Completely.
The silence that followed was heavier than the bucket beside her.
Elena.
6 years. 6 years since she'd heard him say her name. 6 years since he'd disappeared without a goodbye. 6 years since she'd walked away carrying a secret that had grown into a little boy with his father's gray eyes and crooked smile. She didn't turn around. She couldn't. She was supposed to be invisible, a housekeeper sent by the cleaning agency to polish marble floors and dust priceless art. Not the woman Julian Cross had once promised to marry. Not the girl who had believed love mattered more than money until life proved otherwise. Elena, is that really you? His voice cracked just enough for her to remember the man he'd been before billions of dollars, board meetings, and magazine covers turned him into someone the whole world recognized. Slowly, she rose to her feet. When she finally faced him, Julian Cross looked at her as though he had just seen someone rise from the dead. Neither of them spoke. 6 years ago, they had planned a future together. 6 years ago, she had vanished. Now she stood before him in a gray housekeeping uniform, her hands rough from bleach, while he stood in an Italian suit worth more than her yearly salary. "You work here?" he finally asked. It wasn't disgust. It wasn't pity. It was disbelief. "I need the job," Elena answered softly. She lowered her eyes and reached for her bucket, desperate to leave before he asked the one question she couldn't answer. "Where did you go?" Because the truth wasn't something she could say standing in the middle of his living room. The truth was waiting 4 miles away at a daycare center. A 6-year-old boy who laughed exactly like Julian. A little boy who asked almost every night why everyone else had a father except him. 6 years earlier, none of this seemed possible. Elena Marsh was 23, working double shifts at a diner off Halsted Street, saving nickels in a mason jar labeled someday. Julian was 26, and though she didn't know it then, he was already the reluctant heir to Cross Industries, a boy raised in boardrooms who'd slipped out one night wearing a stranger's jacket just to feel invisible for a few hours. He walked into her diner soaked from the rain, ordered black coffee he didn't drink, and stayed until closing just to hear her talk. He never told her who he was. Not the whole truth. He said his name was Julian, that he worked in finance, that his family was complicated. She never asked for more, because she'd learned early that people who wanted to be loved for themselves didn't advertise their money, and for 4 months, in a cramped studio apartment above a laundromat, Elena believed she'd found something real. He fixed her leaking faucet with his own hands. He memorized the way she took her coffee. He told her, on a night she still replayed sometimes at 3 a.m., that he wanted a life with her kids, a small house, none of the noise he'd grown up around. Then one morning he was simply gone. No note, no call. Just an empty side of the bed and a silence that never explained itself. 3 weeks later, Elena found out she was pregnant, and by then she'd already convinced herself the man she loved had never existed at all, just a stranger who got bored and disappeared, the way rich men sometimes did with poor girls, a story so common it barely qualified as tragedy anymore. What she didn't know, what she would only learn much, much later, when the truth would detonate everything she thought she understood about her own life, was that Julian never left by choice. Back in the penthouse, 6 years later, Elena finished her shift in silence, and Julian didn't stop her again, though she felt his eyes on her back the entire time, heavy as a held breath. She walked out of Cross Tower into a gray Chicago evening, picked up her son Noah from daycare, and held his small hand the whole ride home on the bus, gripping it tighter than she meant to. "Mommy, you're squeezing," Noah said. "Sorry, baby." She loosened her grip, but her mind was somewhere else entirely, replaying gray eyes across a marble floor, a voice that hadn't changed in 6 years, a man who was supposed to be a closed chapter and was instead standing very much alive in the one place she couldn't avoid if she wanted to keep her job, her apartment, her son's insurance. Because no one needed that insurance.
Badly.
He'd been born with a heart condition the doctors called manageable until 8 months ago, when manageable stopped being the word they used. Now the word was surgery, and the number attached to it had more zeros than Elena had ever seen outside of a lottery billboard. The housekeeping agency job wasn't glamorous, but it came with benefits that covered 30% of what insurance alone would never touch, and 30% was the difference between her son living to see 7 and Elena bearing a small casket she couldn't bear to think about. She'd taken the cross-tower assignment without knowing whose penthouse it was. The agency didn't share client names until the day of appointment. By the time she'd read Cross Industries on the elevator directory, it was too late to turn back, and some reckless, wounded part of her almost wanted to see if it really was him. Now she knew, and she had exactly one choice in front of her. Quit, protect the secret, and lose the coverage her son's life depended on, or stay, and pray that Julian Cross, a man who apparently still remembered her name after 6 years, never found out that somewhere across the city, his son was sleeping in a bed with a nightlight shaped like a rocket ship because he was afraid of the dark.
She chose to stay.
She told herself it was about the paycheck. She was wrong, and she knew it the moment she made the decision. 3 days later, Julian requested her specifically for a private meeting in his office, and when Elena arrived, heart hammering, she found him standing at the window with the whole city glittering behind him like a crown he never asked to wear. "Sit," he said, not unkindly. "I'd rather stand." He turned around, and for a moment the confident CEO mask slipped, revealing something rawer underneath. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to actually listen before you decide to hate me." "I don't hate you, Julian. I don't feel anything for you." The lie tasted like copper in her mouth. "I didn't leave you," he said. "Someone made me leave." Elena's breath caught.
What?
"My grandmother," Julian said, and his jaw tightened like the words physically hurt to say.
She found out about you.
"About us. She sent people to buy you off, and when that didn't work fast enough, she threatened to bankrupt the diner you worked at, fire the owner, blacklist you from ever waitressing in this city again, unless I left without a word. She told me you'd already agreed. She showed me a signed letter, in your handwriting, saying you wanted money to disappear." Elena's whole world tilted sideways. "I never wrote that. I never saw a cent." "I know that now," Julian said quietly. "I didn't know it then. I was 26 and terrified of losing everyone I loved, because I'd already lost my parents in a car accident when I was 19, and my grandmother was the only family I had left holding the company together. I believed her because believing you'd betrayed me hurt less than believing she'd lied to my face." The silence between them stretched long enough to become its own kind of confession. 6 years, Julian," Elena finally said, voice shaking. 6 years I thought you just got tired of me.
Do you understand what that did to me?
What I had to survive alone because of a lie some old woman told to keep her empire clean?" "I'm sorry," he said, and it sounded like it cost him something to say it. "I've spent 6 years hating a version of you that never existed." Elena looked at him for a long moment, torn between fury and an old, dangerous tenderness she thought she'd killed years ago. And then, because the truth had already begun cracking open everything around them, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever, though she told herself in that instant she was only being fair. "There's something you don't know either," she said. Julian went very still.
"Elena."
"I have a son," she said. "He's 5, no. He just turned 6. His name is Noah." The color drained from Julian's face in a way Elena had never seen on another human being, like watching a house go dark room by room. "How old did you say he was?" 6, Elena repeated, and watched the math land behind his eyes like a slow-motion collision.
"Anna."
His voice cracked on her name. "Is he mine?" She didn't answer right away, and in the silence, 6 years of grief, resentment, love, and fear crashed into the room all at once. Finally, she nodded once, and Julian Cross, a man who negotiated billion-dollar mergers without blinking, sat down hard in his chair like his legs had simply stopped working. "I have a son," he whispered. "I have a son I never got to hold. You have a son who's needed emergency heart surgery for 8 months, and I've been begging insurance companies and charity funds because his father was busy being lied to by his own family, Elena said, and the words came out sharper than she intended, 6 years of exhaustion finally spilling over. Julian looked up at her, eyes wet, jaw trembling with something between grief and fury. Tell me what he needs. Tell me right now. I don't want your money, Julian. This isn't about money, he said, standing, crossing the room until he was close enough that she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes. This is about my son. Please, Elena. Let me be his father before it's too late to matter. If viewers are feeling something right now, the heartbreak, the years stolen, the truth finally breaking loose, this is the moment to pause and say so in the comments. And if this story is affecting you emotionally, hit like before we go any further because it only gets heavier from here. Elena agreed to let Julian meet Noah, though every instinct in her told her this would only complicate a life she'd worked so hard to keep simple. What she didn't expect was how naturally Noah gravitated toward him, how the boy who was usually shy with strangers climbed onto the office couch next to Julian within 20 minutes and started explaining, in exhaustive detail, why dinosaurs were better than dragons. Julian listened like it was the most important briefing of his career. Later, after Noah fell asleep in the car on the ride home, Elena caught Julian watching the boy in the rearview mirror with an expression she couldn't name, something between wonder and grief for all the years he'd missed. I want to be part of his life, Julian said. Not just his medical bills.
His life.
Birthdays. Bedtimes. All of it. That's not how this works, Elena said. You can't just buy your way into fatherhood after 6 years. I'm not trying to buy anything. I'm trying to earn it. She wanted to believe him. That was the terrifying part. Some stubborn, foolish piece of her heart still wanted to believe him, the way it had 4 months into a relationship with a man who claimed to work in finance and turned out to own half the skyline. But before Elena could decide how much of her guarded heart to hand back over, a new complication arrived wearing red lipstick and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Her name was Vanessa Kane, and she strode into Julian's office 3 days later without knocking, dropping a folder onto his desk like a queen delivering an execution order. We need to talk about the board meeting, Vanessa said, before her eyes landed on Elena standing near the window. Something flickered across her face, recognition, and beneath it, something colder.
Oh.
You're the housekeeper. Vanessa, Julian said, tension threading through his voice. This isn't the time. Actually, it's exactly the time, Vanessa said, crossing her arms. Your grandmother's will require you to be married before your 30th birthday, or the entire company transfers to the board's control, including my father's seat, which conveniently becomes majority stakeholder. That birthday is 6 weeks away, Julian. Have you told your little housekeeper that yet? Elena felt the floor shift beneath her for the second time in a week. Married, she repeated. Surely you didn't think this was going to be simple, Vanessa said, an unsettling smile curling at the edges of her mouth. Julian and I were engaged before you so conveniently reappeared. Some of us actually understand what's at stake here. We were never engaged, Julian said sharply. We dated for 4 months 2 years ago, and I ended it because something felt wrong, though I could never prove what. Vanessa's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes went very still, and Elena, watching closely, some old instinct sharpening inside her, noticed it. That night, lying awake with Noah's small foot pressed against her ribs in their shared bed, Elena turned Vanessa's words over and over. Married before 30, or the company falls into the board's hands. And Vanessa's father conveniently benefiting from that exact outcome. It was too clean, too convenient. Something wasn't sitting right, and Elena had learned the hard way that when something didn't sit right, it usually meant somebody was lying. The next morning, Julian showed up at her apartment door, disheveled, like he hadn't slept either. I have a proposal, he said, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you say no. Julian. Marry me, he said. Not because of the will. Not only because of the will. Marry me because it's the only way I can protect Noah's medical coverage under the family trust, protect you from Vanessa's father trying to dig up dirt to discredit you, and give us 6 weeks to figure out if what we had 6 years ago is worth rebuilding. A real chance, Elena. Not charity. Not a business deal pretending to be a marriage. A real one. Elena stared at him, heart pounding somewhere near her throat. You want a marriage of convenience. I want a marriage of truth, Julian said. The convenience is just how we get there.
She should have said no.
Every rational, protective, hard-earned instinct told her to say no. But she thought of Noah's surgery, of the mounting bills, of 6 years spent fighting alone, and some quieter voice underneath all of it whispered that maybe, just maybe, this was the universe finally handing back what it had stolen. Okay, she said. But this is for Noah. Nothing else. Julian nodded, though something in his eyes said he was hoping for more, and neither of them noticed the black sedan parked across the street, or the woman inside it photographing the doorway with a long lens, jaw set with a fury that had nothing to do with company shares and everything to do with a secret buried 6 years deep that was about to come roaring back to the surface. The wedding was small, quiet, and entirely too fast for Elena's mind to process before she found herself standing in a courthouse in a borrowed dress, Noah as the ring-bearer, grinning ear to ear because his mother was marrying his new best friend, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering just outside the frame. The storm arrived 4 days later in the form of a manila envelope slipped under the door of Elena's new penthouse suite while Julian was at a board meeting. Inside was a photograph. Old, slightly yellowed, clearly 6 years old. It showed a young woman signing a document across from an older woman in pearls, Julian's grandmother, unmistakably. And the young woman's face, though angled away from the camera, was wearing Elena's coat. Elena's exact coat, the green wool one she'd owned in her diner days, the one she'd donated to charity years ago because it no longer fit after Noah was born. Attached was a note, typed and signed. You weren't the only one paid to disappear. Ask Vanessa what she really signed 6 years ago and why she's been so desperate to marry into this family ever since. Elena's hands went cold. She sat with the photograph for nearly 20 minutes before she understood what it meant, and when she finally did, the realization hit like a physical blow. It wasn't her in the photo. It was Vanessa. Elena called Julian immediately, voice shaking so hard he could barely understand her over the phone, and within the hour, he was standing in their living room staring at the photograph like it was a bomb about to detonate the last 6 years of everything he thought he understood. That's not possible, he said. Vanessa and I didn't even meet until 3 years ago. Then why is she in a photo with your grandmother 4 years before that? Elena asked. And why does the timing match exactly when I disappeared? Julian's face went ashen. Because it wasn't a coincidence that Vanessa came into my life. My grandmother introduced us. She said Vanessa was the daughter of an old business partner. That we'd be good together. His voice dropped. What if my grandmother didn't just pay you off, Elena? What if she was building a replacement the entire time? Someone to slot into my life the second you were gone. The full shape of the betrayal was still forming, still incomplete, and that incompleteness was its own kind of horror. Because if Vanessa had been planted in Julian's life 6 years ago, orchestrated by his own grandmother, that meant everything about their courtship, the introductions, the engagement talk, the timing of her sudden reappearance now. At the exact moment Elena walked back in, none of it had been chance. All of it had been architecture. We need to talk to your grandmother, Elena said. She's been in a care facility for 2 years, Julian said. Early dementia. Some days she barely remembers my name. Then we need to talk to Vanessa, Elena said, before she decides we know too much. But Vanessa had already decided. That same evening, she requested an emergency board meeting, and when Julian and Elena arrived, they found her standing at the head of the table with a stack of documents and an expression of icy triumph that made Elena's stomach drop. I think it's time everyone understood who Julian actually married, Vanessa said, sliding a folder across the polished wood. A woman with no verifiable employment history for 3 years. A woman who conveniently worked her way into Cross Tower as a housekeeper. A woman whose son's birth certificate lists no father, filed the same month Julian mysteriously broke off contact with a mystery woman from his wild days. Does that not strike anyone else as remarkably convenient? Say what you're actually accusing me of, Elena said, voice steady despite the fire building in her chest. I'm saying, Vanessa said, that you tracked Julian down, got yourself hired into his home, and manufactured a paternity claim to secure access to his fortune before the inheritance deadline. I'm saying the entire marriage is a fraud, and the board deserves to know before Julian signs away controlling shares to a woman running a con 6 years in the making. The room went utterly silent. Elena felt every eye turn toward her, weighing, judging, and for one terrifying moment, she understood exactly how easy it would be for this lie to become the accepted truth, the way Julian's grandmother's lie had once rewritten both their lives without either of them consenting to it. There's a DNA test, Julian said finally, voice hard as steel. Noah's paternity has already been confirmed privately, and I'll release it to this board the moment it's relevant, which is never, because my marriage is not up for a vote. Then perhaps, Vanessa said unbothered, the board should ask why the photograph currently circulating among certain journalists shows your bride's coat at a payoff meeting that predates your supposed reunion by 6 years. Curious, isn't it, how many secrets this family seems to be collecting? Elena's blood ran cold. Circulating among journalists. This wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a detonation already set in motion, and there was no way to know how many people had already seen the photograph, how many stories were already being written, and how many lies were about to be printed as truth. You sent that photograph, Elena said quietly, understanding crashing over her all at once. You sent it to me, not to expose yourself, to make me panic, to make me turn on Julian before I understood what it actually proved. Vanessa's composure cracked for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. You wanted me to think it was evidence against you, Elena continued, voice rising with the force of finally understanding, but it wasn't a slip. It was bait. You wanted me scared and reactive, coming to Julian in a panic, sowing doubt between us right when the board deadline mattered most. Because if our marriage collapsed from the inside, you wouldn't need photographs or lawsuits. You'd just need Julian single again, right on schedule. The boardroom held its breath. That's an interesting theory, Vanessa said, too calm, too controlled. But theories don't win in front of a board, Elena. Documents do. And I have 6 years of documents. So do I, said a voice from the doorway, and every head turned as an elderly woman in a wheelchair was pushed into the room by a caretaker, her eyes sharper than anyone expected from someone the family had described as fading. Julian's grandmother, Margaret Cross, looked around the room with the cold clarity of someone who had orchestrated far more in her lifetime than anyone in that room fully understood. Grandmother, Julian said, stunned. You shouldn't be out of the facility. I built this company from nothing while men underestimated me at every turn, Margaret said, voice thin but unmistakably commanding. I am not going to die in bed while a girl who married into this family for a payout finishes what I never intended to start. Elena's stomach dropped. Even now, at the edge of everything, Margaret still believed the lie. I never took a payout, Elena said. I never signed anything. You need to understand that before this goes any further. Margaret's eyes narrowed, studying her the way one studies an unfamiliar signature. 6 years ago, I sat across from a young woman who signed papers agreeing never to contact my grandson again in exchange for $200,000. Her gaze slid, slowly, deliberately, to Vanessa. I remember her coat. Green wool. I remember thinking how out of place it looked against the leather chairs in my study. The room went dead silent. It wasn't you, Margaret said to Elena, voice suddenly uncertain in a way that frightened everyone in the room more than her earlier confidence had. Was it? No, Elena said softly. It wasn't. Every eye in the room turned to Vanessa, whose carefully constructed composure finally, publicly, shattered. You don't understand what it was like, Vanessa said, voice cracking, years of restraint collapsing all at once. My father's company was drowning. Cross Industries was our only lifeline, and your grandmother approached me, with an offer. Get close to Julian. Make sure the girl he was seeing disappeared quietly. In exchange, she'd secure my father's company and eventually, if things worked out, a marriage that would save us both.
I didn't create the plan.
I just executed it. And I've spent 6 years actually falling for him for real, only to watch him choose a housekeeper over everything I built. You broke two people's lives to save your father's business, Julian said, disgust and disbelief warring in his voice. And you broke mine, Vanessa shot back, the second she walked back through that door. Margaret Cross closed her eyes, and for the first time in the entire encounter, looked every one of her 83 years. I did this, she whispered. I did this to my own grandson because I was terrified he'd choose love over legacy, and now I've cost him 6 years he can never get back. The silence that followed held decades of regret, betrayal, and the terrible, fragile hope that maybe, even now, something broken this badly could still be repaired. Vanessa was escorted out by security within the hour, her father's board seat quietly suspended pending investigation, and the photograph that had threatened to detonate Elena's fragile new marriage instead became the very evidence that unraveled 6 years of manufactured lies. But even as one mystery closed, Elena felt the ground still trembling beneath her, because trust, once broken this deeply, doesn't simply reassemble itself the moment the truth comes out. It has to be rebuilt, brick, by people willing to stay in the wreckage long enough to do it. That night, after Noah was finally asleep, Julian found Elena sitting alone on the balcony, city lights scattered below like something too beautiful to trust. I keep thinking about all the years we lost, he said quietly, sitting beside her. Noah's first steps. His first word. The day you found out you were pregnant and had no one to tell. I thought about you every single day, Elena admitted, voice barely above a whisper. Even when I hated you, even when I told myself I was over it, there was always this small, stupid part of me that wondered if somewhere you were thinking about me too. I was, Julian said. Every day. I told myself it was anger. It wasn't. It was grief for something I didn't even understand I'd lost. I'm scared, Elena admitted. Not of Vanessa. Not of your grandmother. I'm scared of trusting you completely and finding out there's another lie underneath this one. I don't know if I can survive being wrong about you twice. Julian took her hand, slow and careful, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. Then let me earn it, he said. Not in 6 weeks. Not because of a will or a deadline. For the rest of however long you'll let me try. 6 weeks later, Noah went into surgery under the full coverage of the Cross Family Medical Trust, and Elena sat in the waiting room gripping Julian's hand so tightly her knuckles went white, both of them silent, both of them praying to whatever would listen. When the surgeon finally emerged, smiling, saying the words successful and strong heartbeat, Elena broke down sobbing into Julian's shoulder, 6 years of exhaustion and fear finally allowed to leave her body all at once. Margaret Cross, in the final months of her life, rewrote her will one more time, this time not as a demand but as an apology, ensuring Noah's future and formally, publicly, welcoming Elena into a family that had once tried to erase her. Before she passed, she told Julian something Elena never forgot, something he repeated to her on quiet nights for years afterward. I spent my whole life believing love was a weakness that could be managed out of people. I was wrong. The only thing I ever truly built that mattered was the family I almost destroyed trying to protect. If this story has taught you anything about the cost of assumptions, about the wounds we carry from lies we never got to question, and about the fragile, stubborn power of love that survives even when everything conspires against it, then make sure to subscribe for more stories like this one. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always finds its way home, and tell us in the comments the biggest lesson you're taking with you. Because in the end, Elena and Julian's story wasn't really about billionaires, or boardrooms, or inheritances built on secrets. It was about two people who lost 6 years to a lie neither of them chose, and found their way back to each other anyway. Proof that some love doesn't disappear when it's stolen from you. It just waits, quietly, for the truth to finally let it breathe again.